Now, you rapscallions, settle down. I don't imagine any of you read this week's homework. I did, but I was a little confused. Well, what part of the reading confused you, boy? I just don't understand how this system works, sir. Like the book mentions market forces, but then talks about how some sectors are bad for markets. I thought capitalism was all about markets being the perfect solution. Well, son, that's because this class isn't about capitalism now, is it? It's not? Did you already forget what class you're in, you little dumb f***? I did, sir, yes. Well then, allow me to refresh your memory. This class is on Supercapitalism 101. Americans are desperate to see things change, but a lot of productive conversations about what to do get bogged down once a conservative calls an idea socialism. Plenty of sensible, popular ideas like raising taxes a little bit on the rich or having the government do things other than violence get labeled socialism, and through that label are almost dead on arrival. Like if we didn't already have public schools in America and somebody introduced the idea today, you'd have conservatives on the Senate floor calling it Marxism on our shores, claiming that their fight against public school buses is somehow as righteous as Mandela's anti-apartheid struggle. So today I want to start discussing solutions and ideas on their own terms. I don't want to use any labels politicians and think tanks have spent more than a century trying to convince people means bad people thing me no like. I just want to convince you that what I'm talking about is good for people on its own, divorced from any ideological affiliation. So let's not call today's topic a part of socialism. In fact, I'm sure some socialists out there wouldn't consider it a part of socialism anyways, given that worker co-ops still operate under the profit motive and the commodity form. Instead, let's call it Supercapitalism. Who knows, maybe that silly label will open somebody's eyes. Today's introductory topic into the world of supercapitalism is worker cooperatives. I'll go into what a workers' co-op is, why they should be encouraged, and why they're effective business models. Without further ado, let's go. Part 1. What is a co-op exactly? A typical company has employees, managers, a boss, and owners. Of course, there's variation, but regardless of specific structure, most capitalist companies have a top-down internal hierarchy. Your boss or the owner says what's what, your managers relay what's what, and you follow orders, rarely able to impact what's what. And opposite the flow of information is that of profit. All money made by the employees, due in part to the guidance of the managers, gets ruled over by the boss or the owner. A workers' cooperative, though, is the employees running the show. They say, "Piss off, mate," to the owner and or the boss, and remove them from the equation. The employees become their own bosses. Neato. The justifying logic is that the owners don't contribute to the flow of the work, and the boss largely just barks down orders, yet they're getting all of the monies. So co-ops get rid of the owner and the boss, and don't let them bark orders or take all of the monies. And though it might sound odd, it's really that simple. Just a bunch of employees vibing as they do their dang old thing. So you might be asking, how are decisions made? How do they decide how many hours the workday is, how much to charge for a product, or how much everyone gets paid? Well, the employees get together, discuss the topic at length, and vote on what to do. Because democracy in the workplace is a foundational principle of a worker cooperative. Along that line, managers are elected by the employees, not selected by a boss. You also might be asking, what's the pay scale look like if there's no owner? Once again, that's decided by the employees, but generally worker co-ops have a locked pay scale. as in managers can only make a maximum of 4 or 5 or however many times the rate of a common employee. Whereas in a normal company, the owner or boss can fuck off to Rio with the bonus they just wrote themselves, while their laboring employees are stuck with their shitty minimum wage. In a workers' co-op, if the managers want to give themselves a raise, the base pay rate for regular employees has to rise to match the pay scale. And of course, the employees have to get together and agree on the new pay rates. But other than that, they're just a normal old business, owned and democratically operated by their workers. Now that right there, folks, is a much too quick summary of co-ops. If you'd like to learn more, there's plenty of resources down in the dibbly-doo, but for now, allow me to argue why co-ops are morally good. Part 2. The moral arguments for co-ops. First off, for a certain kind of person that I sincerely hope this video reaches, I want to point out that worker co-ops are private institutions. Ain't no big government here, boy. Just us workers living it up in a freedom paradise. Woohoo! Of course, I say that with a bit of my tongue lodged in my cheek, but it is a genuine plus that co-ops exist in their own sphere, self-reliant, and don't require the state for their well-being, since they set out to improve the well-being of their workers on their own, which is kinda neat. Anyway, that's a minor part of what makes co-ops a moral dub. Just felt like peppering it in here. So let's get to the meat and potatoes of this argument. The main arguments for co-ops come from valuing labor in the workplace. At the moment, we value financialization, advertising, and being in charge, and we devalue the input of labor, down to the very words our culture uses to describe the average worker. Phrases like low-skilled and burger flipper are all too common and all too demeaning. But that dynamic of who we value and who we devalue is out of whack, flipped in the wrong direction. The critique here follows a simple idiom. You don't need your boss needs you. Owners and bosses can do whatever market research they want to marginally better target their product, but they can't complete the sale of it if they don't have the labor of a worker. Burgers need flipped, packages need sorted, but a burger flipper or delivery person doesn't need an owner. A business can exist just fine without the financialization or marketing folks argue owners bring to the table. And elements of decision-making in the production line that we might call more so necessary are still irrelevant if not for the common worker. A slightly more efficient conveyor belt is useless without employees, you know? And notice that I'm arguing necessity, not value here, because the obvious and tired follow-up if I were arguing value would be, the market determines value, and it's a boss man more important. Rather, I'm saying the necessity of a laborer is greater than the necessity of an owner or a boss. Since the labor of the common worker is the most necessary, it stands to reason that the workers are entitled to all they create, or at least entitled to make decisions about all they create. The fact that we currently run things in the exact opposite way is a little shitty. Like, it sucks that at the moment you have to break your back or stress your brain out all day, and in the meantime, you don't even get paid what you're worth because the owner needs to turn a profit and slide some fat stacks into the pocket of shareholders. And if that's not bad enough, you often don't even get a say on how the place is run. So, the argument for co-ops goes, give workers control of their workplace. Democratize the bitch. I imagine the first counter-argument people would have is, hang on now, owners contribute by providing the monies. They invest in the business and make it possible, so they deserve control. But when you really think about it, that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, innit? If you organize society for all time so that owners, a small part of the population who owns most everything, make all the money, while the people that work for them make very little, of course the people who own most of everything are gonna be the ones with all of the money to invest. That's a side effect of the model they've set up, not a justification for its further existence. So when people say owners invest, therefore they're valid, what they're ignoring is that some external body could step in to provide the capital or relax legislation so that the workers of a company can fill the owner role. Just because a very small owning class currently is the main source for investing, doesn't mean that they should be our primary source of investment income, or that they're for some self-ordained reason the best people to make that happen. Now, you might also be saying to yourself, well, the owner I work for is nice, so I don't really see the need to democratize my workplace. This reminds me of an argument often used to union bust. People like working for us, so why do they need a union? But those arguments fail to recognize that when we're talking about unions and worker co-ops, we're talking about an expansion of democracy. If we can understand why it's important for regular people to elect the president and senators, we can understand why it's important for people to have a say in their workplace. Like, could you for a moment imagine if, after a string of a few good presidents, which is hard enough to believe on its own, but bear with me, imagine if large swaths of Americans were suddenly like, well, we don't really need to be electing people anymore, they seem to know what they're doing. Like, that is such monarchist, submissive brain rot. And I don't mean the kinky kind of submissive, I mean the boot-licking kind of sub. And to be clear, I also don't mean the sexy kind of boot-licking, Jesus Christ, I hope I'm making sense. You also might be thinking, well, sure, owners and shareholders might not do that much in the actual flow of production, but bosses fill an important role, so we should at least keep bosses around, right? But I think that concern falsely assumes that functionality in a workplace requires one person to give all the orders, one supreme leader with a clear vision to give guidance, lest the workers run around aimlessly like heads with their chickens cut off. But again, to draw the comparison to electoral democracy, would anyone here say that a country is best run by an unelected supreme leader, that a moneyed political elite should just select a president at will and we, the citizens, have to learn to deal with their orders because that's just what's in our best interest, right? No, of fucking course not. So again, if we can understand why a dictator is bad to run our country, we can see how an unelected boss's unbridled power over a workplace is unfair. Now you might be thinking, well sure, Piley, bosses aren't fun. Believe me, I've wanted to strangle mine a few times. But even if we do bring democracy to the workplace, we need someone at the top to do all the businessy tasks. And I hear ya, imagined skeptic. But if we snap back to reality, we'll see that plenty of businesses, even ones attached to a franchise, are self-sustaining without the need for a corporate owner. To explain what I mean, let's head on over to the anecdote corner. My longtime roommate in college worked at a convenience store. Let's call it a quick stop. After a few promotions, cause the lad's a hard worker, he eventually became a manager. At which point his duties became to take inventory, order stock, and make decisions about what kind of products to sell. And as far as upkeep on a store is concerned, that's pretty much all the important shit. Now, were these tasks crucial to the success of the business, completed by some wrinkly-brained, 7,000 IQ Harvard business grad who owned the place? No, it was my college student roommate who sometimes forgot what day it was, who completed all those tasks with about as much efficiency as you can ask for. Americans seem to assume that maintaining a business is a Herculean task that only the people God blessed with the smart gene can do. But that assumption massively underestimates the skill and intelligence of the common worker. Regular Joes are perfectly capable of doing all this shit. And to make my anecdote even more relevant, this quick stop didn't have an on-site owner. It was owned by corporate, with their correspondents rarely checking in or making decisions. So for all intents and purposes, this store was operated by its workers. The managers managed and the employees did their thing, but they didn't need corporate. They themselves did most of the tasks we assume a boss or owner do, by virtue of bosses and owners being such big-brained, smart, sexy people. If you think employees running the show can't work, I have a feeling you interact with at least one business on a regular basis that is largely self-sustained by its workers. And if your argument is that some form of leadership is necessary, that's a role an elected manager can perfectly fill. It doesn't have to be a boss chosen by the investors. And I'd argue that the elected manager position kind of meets this middle ground in a nice way. Now that about sums up my moral arguments for worker co-ops. To be clear, I think these arguments justify the concept on their own. In my eyes, the workers having control of what they produce, or at least having a say over what their labor creates, validates worker co-ops on its own. That democracy in the workplace should be pursued regardless of its efficiency. But I recognize that such a line of argument won't win everyone over. So for all you number crunching nerds out there, let's get into why worker co-ops are good for business. Part 3. Business is boomin'. It's important to set parameters up front for how to discuss the efficiency of co-ops. Namely, that this conversation will not revolve around profitability. To a traditional firm, wages are a burden, and so constant measures, which include but are not limited to union busting, are utilized to keep wages as low as possible. But worker cooperatives are more so centered around making sure the workers get constant raises to match the value of their labor. So the operating costs will by their nature be a bit less profitable than traditional firms, making it less than conclusive to study profitability. Instead, the literature and research in the field looks at productivity, as productivity can be tied to just kind of the base efficiency of a company, which is able to be compared across all types of firms. So with that out of the way, let's see how productive worker cooperatives really can be. It's well substantiated by now that employee involvement increases productivity. By directly involving employees in the success of a company, you not only incentivize folks to be a bit more productive, but you create a culture where their contributions feel meaningful. Various studies have found that such incentives increase productivity in co-ops as well. Now the big question for worker co-ops is, are traditional firms best at applying these incentive structures? Or is there something to the essence of worker co-ops that utilizes this trend to its fullest? According to the research, summarized here by Professor Perotin, contrary to popular thinking and to the pessimistic predictions of some theorists, solid, consistent evidence across countries, systems, and time periods shows that worker cooperatives are at least as productive as traditional firms, and more productive in some areas. The main factor that seems to make co-ops equally or even more productive than their traditional counterparts is involvement in decision-making, which, unlike stock incentives, seems to be a harder point for traditional businesses to concede. A meta-analysis from 1995 found that not only does employee participation increase productivity, but that those increases are higher for co-ops than the same measures in traditional firms. So clearly there's something about the culture of democracy in the workplace that co-ops cultivate that, on their own, increase productivity, separate from any sort of monetary incentives. And any model that can increase productivity that well is worth looking into. 1 point to the co-ops. Now some folks out there will argue that worker co-ops may be more productive, but that they're unsustainable. That because of their focus on raising the standard of living for their employees, they're prone to underinvestment, which would eventually lead to their collapse. And this does seem to be a problem co-ops have to be weary of. A string of bust co-ops in the UK ran into the issue of a generational pump and dump, where the original employees made decisions that benefit their well-being, not the long-term viability of the co-op, and eventually they went under and sold off to private traditional firms. But I want to give a quick pushback that I didn't even see any of the studies provide. Believe it or not, underinvestment can happen in traditional firms just as easily. Like it's totally possible for any Fortune 500 company to dump too much into their shareholders' wallets and for the company to go under. Investment versus operating costs is a basic part of running a business of any kind. So while there are tendencies co-ops need to be aware of, some folks try to frame underinvestment as a uniquely co-op problem, which it isn't, and it's blatantly in the interest of upholding the traditional pro-corporate, pro-rich people business model to try to frame underinvestment as just a thing co-ops have to worry about. But, more to the point, it seems plenty of co-ops have found ways to mitigate the pitfalls of underinvestment through a process sometimes called asset locking. You see, the problem with the aforementioned bust co-ops is that they left all or most of their assets to be dispersed amongst employees, or at least put most assets on the voting block, and so a lot of the employees voted in ways that would give them immediate access to the fruits of their labor. And you know what? There's nothing morally wrong there. Like if a group of people start a factory, work there for 40 years, and want to retire with sizable package to set their families up well, who's to say that that's wrong exactly? But for the sake of sustainability, to keep the co-op from selling out to a traditional firm, it's in their best interest to, as a group, decide to lock some assets so they can perpetually benefit the co-op. And in fact, a bunch of studies found that worker-owned firms, under the right preventative structures, don't suffer from underinvestment. Now, how does that work? A few studies found that co-ops plow back profits at high rates, meaning a high percentage of profits go back to investment. Whether that's because of regulation or co-op structure, it seems plowing back profits at a high rate reliably fixes the underinvestment problem. In fact, plenty of co-ops plow back profits above the rate of traditional firms. It seems that co-ops focus more on job security, because the people making decisions, actually feel the pain if the company goes under, which isn't really the case for rich business owners. So when the co-op is presented the value of sustainability, they decide to plow back profits to keep their jobs and future jobs secure. Also, in general, these sustainable practices help co-ops survive crisis. A seesaw? Ketchup? A seesaw study found that co-ops fared better than their traditional counterparts after the 2008 financial crash, as it seems they had stronger long-term investment and profit plowback structures. So clearly, co-ops fare pretty well in our market economies, both in terms of productivity and in terms of creating models that allow for prolonged success. Neat shit, if you ask me. Time for a conclusion. Part 4. Conclusion. Worker co-ops are just dang ol' neat, right? Like it's cool for workers to have a say in how their workday goes, or what happens with what they make. Plus, they have a propensity to be more productive and, under the right circumstances, more sustainable than traditional companies. Learning about worker co-ops has been so weirdly giddy for me. The simple idea of them makes me happy in a way I can't quite describe. And if I'm doing my job right, I hope some of you out there are as excited about the concept as I am. If you want to learn more about them, I have some resources linked down below. But more than anything else, I'd suggest you go listen to Professor Richard Wolff talk about worker co-ops. He opened my eyes to the topic and is just generally a pretty good speaker. And let's end on this. If you're ever thinking, should I form a worker co-op with some of my mates? The answer to your question is always yes. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. Special shout out to all my lovely cooperative patrons, like those whose names are currently on screen. On top of generously supporting me, patrons get access to behind-the-scenes content, early versions of every video essay, and exclusive videos, like this Q&A video I'm working on. So be sure to join me over on Patreon if you want access to all those goodies. Make sure to toss this video a like and subscribe down below. Be sure to ring that little bell and set the notifications to all, so you can know the exact nanosecond I release my next video. Thanks much, and I'll see you next time.